here.
The Spanish moss whispers. Beneath the syrupy humidity and sweet magnolia lies a darkness ancient as the swamp itself. Louisiana doesn't bury its dead, it preserves them. Vengeful spirits, echoes of pain, and a history refusing to rest. Stop listening to the living. Start listening to the screams. This is the definitive count. The top 15 haunted places in Louisiana. 1. Myrtle's Plantation Saint. Francisville. The air surrounding Myrtle's Plantation is heavy, thick with the scent of cypress and a sorrow that never dissipates. Veranda shutters hang crookedly, observing the moss-draped oaks that guard the property like silent, aged sentinels. Beneath the veneer of southern hospitality lies a darkness woven into the very foundation of the 1796 estate. A darkness perpetuated by countless tales of misfortune and murder. Visitors often arrive seeking history, but what they find is an oppressive silence broken only by phenomena that defy explanation. This house, often called one of America's most haunted, is less a dwelling and more a meticulously preserved repository for restless souls. The most famous spectral inhabitant is the enslaved woman named Chloe, a figure whose legend is deeply entrenched in tragedy. She was allegedly murdered for poisoning the family after her ear was severed for eavesdropping. And now, her spectral presence is often identified by the distinct green turban she supposedly wore to conceal her injury. Her motivations, whether vengeful or tragically misunderstood, are secondary to the chilling evidence of her continued residence. Guests who sleep in the rooms adjacent to the general study often report waking to an inexplicable pressure on their chest, the feeling of phantom breath close to the ear, or the unnerving sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps ascending the grand staircase when no one is visible. Chloe's influence is subtle but pervasive, intertwining with the energies of the 10 reported murders that occurred on the property. The plantation's century-old grand piano sometimes plays itself, the keys depressed by invisible weight. Usually a simple, repetitive G minor chord, never a full melody. More disturbing, however, is the consistent photographic evidence. The famous image captured in the central stairwell reveals the translucent figure of a young girl, not Chloe, but perhaps one of the children she accidentally killed, staring directly into the lens. Furthermore, those who linger near the antique mirrors report seeing unauthorized reflections, momentary glimpses of distinct faces peering over their shoulders that vanish the instant they turn their heads. The Myrtle's Plantation does not merely host ghosts. It traps them within its boundaries. The unique southern humidity seems to preserve the past, ensuring that the final, agonizing moments of its dead are replayed without end. To walk these polished floors is to submit to relentless surveillance by the departed, realizing too late that the stories you came to hear are actually warnings meant for those who intend to stay. 2. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. New Orleans. The air inside St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is thick and humid, trapped between the elaborate, oven-like marble crypts established in 1789. This necropolis of the dead reflects New Orleans' unique relationship with mortality, a city where water tables demand that the deceased remain in perpetual, beautiful repose above ground. The tombs lean toward one another like aging giants, their whitewash flaking to reveal the dark, unsettling brick beneath. Even in midday, the labyrinthine paths cast deep, inescapable shadows, ensuring a pervasive sense of claustrophobia that permeates the entire structure. The most famous resident is undoubtedly Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen. Her tomb, once a pilgrimage site, is now heavily protected, yet the belief persists that her spirit still walks the rows. Tourists and locals alike report a sudden, icy drop in temperature and a rustling whisper near her mausoleum, often accompanied by the distinct smell of frankincense and jasmine. Some claim to have seen a tall, spectral woman in a tignon wandering toward the rear of the cemetery just as the gates are locked. a presence said to judge those who enter with irreverence. Less famous, but perhaps more malicious, is the tormented spirit of Jean. According to local lore documented in historical records, Jean was an unfortunate laborer, accidentally bricked into a tomb during emergency repairs in the 1850s. Visitors who stray too far from the marked paths often recount a muffled, desperate pounding emanating from one specific, unmarked crypt near the south wall. The sound begins subtly, like a dropped stone, escalating to a frantic, rhythmic plea for release that defies the silence of the aged stone, often prompting immediate panic attacks in witnesses. Security guards who patrol the grounds at dusk offer the most disturbing accounts. They report that the air temperature drops violently around the site of Jean's alleged entrapment, followed by the faint, chilling odor of decayed linen and stale breath that catches in the throat. It is a suffocating atmosphere, a stark reminder that in this city of the dead, some residents do not rest, but perpetually suffer, demanding an audience with the living through the sound of their eternal, desperate entombment. 3. LaLaurie Mansion, New Orleans. The humidity of the Vieux Carré clings like grave shrouds, thick with the scent of jasmine and ancient corruption. Within this oppressive atmosphere stands 1140 Royal Street. The notorious LaLaurie Mansion, its wrought iron balconies, elegant by day, become cages trapping the malice of the past under the sickly gaslight. Few structures in New Orleans are so drenched in demonstrable evil, its beauty merely a mask for the atrocities committed within by Madame Delphine LaLaurie in the 1830s. The legend, affirmed by historical records following the infamous 1834 fire, details the torture chamber discovered in the attic. Slaves were found mutilated, chained, and subjected to unnameable medical experiments conducted by the seemingly charming socialite. Though Delphine escaped the ensuing mob and vanished into history, the suffering she inflicted remains tethered to the property. Those who have occupied the mansion since have rarely lasted long. Driven out by sensory assaults far beyond typical poltergeist activity, the specific hauntings are intensely auditory and visceral. Residents and maintenance staff report the constant, faint sound of chains dragging across the marble floor of the second story, where Madame LaLaurie's private rooms were located. More horrifying are the screams, not echoing, but seeming to emanate from the very walls, high-pitched, desperate cries that cut off abruptly, suggesting ongoing, agonizing violence. Visitors often experience sudden temperature drops and the distinct sensation of being watched or touched by unseen hands, particularly in the attic, where oppressive fear is so heavy it feels physical. To stand before the LaLaurie Mansion after midnight is to feel the weight of its history settle upon the soul. It is not merely haunted, it is a repository of pain, a perpetual performance of the final moments of the damned. The lights dim, the air stills, and sometimes, if one listens closely to the silence, the faint, brittle laughter of Madame LaLaurie seems to drift down from the upper windows, welcoming the despair of the living into her endless tableau of suffering. Oak Alley Plantation Vacherie. The humidity of the Louisiana River parishes presses down like a shroud, trapping the thick scent of decaying leaves beneath the cathedral arch of Oak Alley's ancient trees. 28 massive live oaks, draped in funereal Spanish moss, lead to the pale facade of the main house, a beautiful yet profoundly heavy sight. This is not a place of peace. It is a monument to the silent suffering that once fueled its opulence, a place where the air seems to cling not just to the skin, but to the soul. The history of Oak Alley is written in the sharp contrast between the grandeur of the house and the bleakness of the reconstructed slave quarters. The residual anguish seems to manifest most clearly on the second floor, the former domain of the plantation's owners, Witnesses frequently report an overwhelming sense of despair near the master bedroom and the distinct aroma of phantom pipe smoke, a remnant of the Vacherie's original residence. However, the most chilling presence belongs to an unknown woman. Often called the Silent Observer, she is known simply as the Ghost of Oak Alley, a slender, silent apparition, always dressed in antiquated gray fabric, who is seen gliding across the central hall or standing motionless on the second-story balcony. Caretakers and late-shift guides document sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature, even in the blistering summer heat, coupled with the feeling of being intensely scrutinized. In the deep, quiet hours before dawn, faint, disembodied weeping has been heard, echoing from the locked rooms. Sounds too real to dismiss as imagination, yet impossible to trace or pinpoint. To walk the length of the famed alley is to feel the weight of centuries pressing down from the shadowed canopy. Visitors sometimes capture blurry images of a pale figure standing under the oaks, watching, but the true horror lies in the silence, the refusal of the spirits of Oak Alley to acknowledge the present, remaining trapped within their gilded cage of pain, forever haunting the space where the beauty of the landscape clashes violently with the darkness of its past. Old State Capitol Building, Baton Rouge. The air inside the old State Capitol Building in Baton Rouge is perpetually thick, not with humidity, but with the dust of unresolved history. Its Gothic Revival architecture, often described as a haunted castle, stands sentinel over the Mississippi River, a stunning yet somber testament to Louisiana's turbulent past. By day, it's a museum. By night, a stage for specters who seem unable to abandon their political machinations or their tragic ends. The most famous of these lingering residents is Charles L. de Fuentes, a former caretaker. In 1886, de Fuentes reportedly suffered a fatal heart attack while climbing the spiraling iron staircase to the third-floor dome, collapsing just as a massive thunderstorm broke over the city. Since that night, employees and late-night security guards have reported a distinct, persistent sound. The weary, rhythmic thump-drag of a body being hauled up those very same steps, often accompanied by the faint, acrid smell of ozone and sweat, even in perfect weather. But de Fuentes is not alone. The Grand Hall, where bitter legislative debates once raged, is subject to extreme temperature fluctuations and inexplicable gusts of wind that extinguish electric lights. Witnesses have seen the fleeting shadow of a diminutive, hunched figure scurrying between the preserved Senate chambers, sometimes whispering fractured, archaic French phrases into the stillness. The most terrifying reports center on the legislative desks themselves, where pens often roll off the pristine surfaces and thick, leather-bound law books sometimes slam shut, as if in violent protest against a perceived injustice, long after the building is locked tight. On the third floor, near the spot where Charles de Fuentes supposedly fell, the chill is bone-deep and absolute. Security footage occasionally captures a translucent haze forming near the banister, a shape that doesn't resolve itself into a person but radiates profound sorrow. Those few who have stayed past midnight report the sound of heavy, choked breathing directly behind them, a chilling reminder that in this old capital, the work and the suffering never truly cease. Six, Dauphine Orléans Hotel New Orleans. The Dauphine Orleans stands on shadowed ground, its restored ironwork laced with the humid, decay-sweet air of the French Quarter. Beneath the veneer of luxury, the hotel retains the heavy silence of its past, a history rooted deeply in vice and tragedy. The structure once served as the locale for May Bailey's Place, one of the city's most infamous licensed brothels, and it is the women and men connected to its dark operations who refuse to check out. This spectral tenancy grants the hotel the chilling reputation of being one of New Orleans' most reliably active paranormal locations. The most persistent and sorrowful manifestation is that of the lost bride. A woman named Millie, who was to marry a Confederate officer during the Civil War era. On their wedding day, while Millie finished dressing in her pristine gown, news arrived that her fiancé had been killed in a sudden duel nearby. Overwhelmed by grief, she reportedly hanged herself in her room before she could ever leave for the ceremony. This profound emotional imprint ensures her constant presence, a spectral echo of eternal betrayal and despair, marking the Dauphine Orleans as a permanent memorial to her unfinished life. Guests and staff report seeing the bride most often in the women's restroom near the courtyard or drifting down the main staircase, always dressed in her antique white gown, weeping soundlessly. Equally chilling is the apparition of the mournful Confederate soldier, sometimes mistaken for a costumed staff member, who vanishes abruptly when approached. He frequently appears near the historic bar area, perhaps perpetually seeking the comfort of a drink he never finished. Reports also describe flickering lights, strange drafts, and phantom whispers, signaling their proximity. The Dauphine Orleans operates today with the peculiar distinction of being inhabited by souls trapped between the sacred and the profane. When the hotel closes its doors to the late-night traffic of Bourbon Street, the true residents emerge. They are merely performing the final, desolate acts of their lives, forever repeating the moment tragedy overtook them in the heart of the quarter, ensuring that their suffering remains a permanent feature of the hotel's atmosphere. Seven, Hotel Provincial New Orleans. The air inside the Hotel Provincial holds a specific, palpable stillness, heavy with the humidity of the French Quarter and the weight of centuries. The antique wrought iron balconies offer little defense against the shadows that cling to the walls of the old structure, a place where the veil between the past and present is dangerously thin. To step inside is to accept the risk of interacting with history that refuses to be confined to textbooks built in the 1800s. This complex served a harrowing, tragic purpose during the Civil War, converted into a Confederate hospital and triage center. The carnage that played out in these halls, the primitive amputations, the agonizing final breaths of the wounded soaked into the very foundation. The lingering suffering here is not a myth. It is a historical residue, felt most intensely in the back wings, specifically buildings 3 and 5, where the wards were once packed wall to wall with the dying. Guests and staff frequently report disturbing phenomena consistent with a traumatic wartime environment. The most common apparition is a desperate Confederate soldier, often seen staggering toward the courtyard, seeking medical attention before dissolving into thin air near the pool area. Others hear the relentless, faint screams echoing from empty rooms, or smell the phantom scent of antiseptic and stale blood near the central stairwells. Perhaps the most aggressive activity centers on room 511, where an unseen force has been known to pull blankets off sleeping guests and switch electrical items on and off with malicious intent, mimicking the ceaseless chaos of an emergency ward that never truly closed down. To stay at the Provincial is to occupy a space still defined by perpetual crisis. When a guest wakes suddenly, believing they have felt a cold, professional hand pressed against their forehead, a spectral nurse checking their fever, they realize they are not simply observing history, they have become its newest, unwilling patient. Eight, Ellerbe Road School, Shreveport. The twilight settles thick and greasy over Shreveport, clinging particularly to the ruins tucked off Ellerbe Road. Here, where the asphalt crumbles into overgrown fields, the remains of the old Ellerbe Road School stand a skeletal monument to forgotten childhoods and something much colder. Locals whisper that the land itself is stained, cursed since the 1930s when the school, already struggling through the Depression, was struck by an epidemic that swept through the student body with unnatural speed. They say that the illness wasn't natural, but the result of something disturbed in the ground beneath the foundations, something ancient and hungry. The official records are sparse, detailing a tragic closure, but the local lore is vivid, speaking of children who simply vanished, taken not by a virus but by the very walls of the building. The legend centers on the gymnasium, a cavernous space now exposed to the elements, where the air temperature consistently drops far below the ambient surroundings. Investigators who dare to enter often report an overwhelming sense of pressure, as if a great weight were pressing down on their chests, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic squeak of sneakers on a polished floor that no longer exists. But the most disturbing phenomenon occurs in the lower classrooms. Visitors sometimes find small items, a polished stone, a marble, a piece of faded chalk arranged neatly on the dust-covered desks. When captured on thermal imaging, these objects radiate cold, residual energy, hinting at hands that placed them there only moments before, hands belonging to entities trapped in a perpetual state of recess. One team recently captured an electronic voice phenomenon EVP in the main hall, a high-pitched, insistent plea simply stating, "Don't ring the bell. We haven't finished." To stand near the school now is to feel observed, watched by eyes that are fixed forever in an empty gaze. As the moon rises, casting deep shadows across the brick facade, a lone, low-frequency hum emanates from the building's core. It's not the sound of wind or structure settling, but the sound of something vibrating with contained, sorrowful energy, the sound of history refusing to rest, perpetually waiting for the school day to finally end. Nellied, Parlange Plantation House, New Roads. The moss hanging from the oaks around Parlange Plantation House doesn't just filter the sunlight. It thickens the air with history, a stagnant humidity that clings like a shroud. This three-story colonial mansion, overlooking False River near New Roads, feels less like a home and more like an ossuary where centuries of privileged sorrow have been carefully preserved. The galleries are wide, but the shadows within are narrow and deep, suggesting secrets the daylight can never fully penetrate. The house's enduring notoriety stems from its occupation during the Civil War, a period that stamped an irreversible violence onto the estate. Legend holds that the most restless resident is General John C. Parlange, a former owner whose duty apparently transcends death. His presence is most acutely felt in the stifling confines of the attic, where Union soldiers once ransacked family treasures. Witnesses report hearing the distinct, heavy thud of military boots pacing directly above the second-floor bedrooms, always followed by the scrape of a chair being violently thrown across bare wooden planks. These auditory hauntings are often accompanied by more intimate, terrifying phenomena on the main staircase. Visitors, particularly those who linger near dusk, have described a sudden, profound drop in temperature, followed by the sensation of a cold, skeletal hand gripping their wrist, a desperate, possessive touch that vanishes the moment they turn. Furthermore, a smaller, younger spirit is rumored to reside here, evidenced by the scent of jasmine and the faint, melancholic crying heard drifting from the unused nursery on the upper floor. One caretaker documented finding the heavy front door bolted from the inside after locking up for the night, the keys still safely in his possession. Parlange is not merely haunted by memory, it is actively occupied by presences that insist on maintaining their eternal, suffocating claim over the property, trapped forever beneath the weight of Louisiana's brooding, humid sky. The Mortuary Haunted House, New Orleans. The oppressive humidity of a New Orleans autumn clung to the brickwork of the mortuary, a former funeral home on Canal Street, now operating as the city's premier haunted attraction. It wasn't the fake gore or strobe lights that settled the dread in your stomach. It was the air, thick and smelling faintly of lilies and decay. This building, established in 1860, handled bodies through 2 centuries of yellow fever and jazz funerals. its drainage systems forever stained by embalming fluid and the blood of the departed. Locals whisper that when the current owners installed new refrigeration units, they didn't just chill the air, they trapped the cold. Bewildered spirits inside. Legend claims the most potent haunting emanates from the chapel where the wealthy Delacroix family held their final rites in the 1890s. The patriarch, rumored to have poisoned his relatives for their estate, was said to be interred prematurely after a nervous doctor misdiagnosed his catatonia. His essence, a creature of frustrated malice, remained tethered to the preparation room where his body was once displayed. During performances, visitors often report a sudden, suffocating pressure on their chest as they pass the antique steel gurney. The specific hauntings are subtle, almost architectural. Security cameras in the basement dissection theater frequently capture a brief shadow moving opposite the actors, a figure too thin and too fast to be human. Employees, who swear the third-floor office is the epicenter, complain of tools being systematically sterilized and rearranged overnight. The faint sound of running water echoing from the dry taps. One maintenance worker quit after finding a perfectly preserved chrysanthemum blossom pressed into the grout of the embalming slab, decades after the last actual service was held there. Tonight, the chilling conclusion came when the attraction's owner reviewed the night's surveillance footage. In a quiet hallway, long after the last paying customer had fled, the camera recorded a figure in dark, antiquated mourning clothes leaning close to a prop casket. It wasn't one of the scare actors. The figure raised a pale, skeletal hand, slowly closed the lid, and then, with unnatural slowness, the door to the preparation room swung shut, locking itself from the inside. USS Kidd Baton Rouge. The air thickens with river fog and the scent of oil and decay around the USS Kidd, a hulking relic moored in Baton Rouge. Inside the destroyer, a chill that has nothing to do with the humid Louisiana heat penetrates the steel bulkheads. It is the palpable cold of 1945, an echo of the sudden, brutal attack that nearly ended the ship and the lives of 38 men off the coast of Okinawa. The Kidd, the only surviving destroyer of its class that retains its wartime configuration, is a museum, but to those who maintain her, she is a tomb still echoing with the panicked shouts of her final battle. The persistent legend among the museum staff centers on the ship's former commanding officer, Captain Tuthill. His stern, spectral figure is often reported on the bridge, a tall, silent silhouette surveying the Mississippi River as if still navigating the volatile Pacific. But the true terror belongs to the lower decks, where the shadows are dense, and the silence is broken only by the drip of condensation and phantom movement. It is here that the casualties of the kamikaze strike are most felt, particularly in the engineering spaces and the sleeping compartments. One night, a security officer logging patrols heard the insistent, rhythmic clatter of a wrench dropping repeatedly onto the steel deck plates near the aft engine room, an area sealed off for preservation. When he investigated, the noise ceased, yet the residual metallic ring lingered. As he swept his flashlight beam across the passageway, the faint but unmistakable scent of burnt flesh and singed uniform fabric overwhelmed the usual smell of rust and diesel. The patrolman retreated, unnerved, but not before witnessing a brief ripple in the dense shadow pool at the junction of two narrow corridors. It wasn't just movement, it was the fleeting outline of a man staggering, clutching his chest, before dissolving back into the absolute dark. The Kidd remains, forever sailing the river of the damned. Its polished brass and clean decks merely a facade over the violent memories of the men still trapped within its cold steel hull, eternally waiting for the all-clear that never sounded. Huma's House Estate and Gardens, Louisiana. The humidity of the Louisiana bayou clings to Huma's house, a viscous shroud that seems to filter the very moonlight. Even at midday, The shadows beneath the colossal oak trees, strung with weeping moss, hold an unnerving coolness. This plantation, once the sugar palace and producer of 20 million pounds of sugar annually, carries the weight of its opulent, yet brutal, history, not just in its architecture, but in the air itself, a palpable, melancholic tension that refuses to dissipate. Local legend focuses heavily on Colonel John Burnside, the extravagant owner who presided over the estate's zenith, but true unease surrounds the enslaved and the forgotten staff. Generations whisper of a specific servant girl named Josephine, who met her end in the main house, perhaps through accident or malice, her tragedy swallowed by the plantation's wealth. Her presence is not marked by the slamming of doors, but by a pervasive, delicate scent of jasmine and burnt sugar that often drifts through the upper floors, particularly the master bedroom, where staff report the constant feeling of being closely observed. The most consistent phenomena, however, center on the sprawling gardens and the flanking garçonnières. Visitors often witness the fleeting image of a small child, usually a boy in antiquated clothing, running just at the periphery of sight near the old cistern. Security footage has occasionally captured odd, translucent shapes moving through the rows of blooming azaleas, shapes that dissolve into the high sun. Those who walk the grounds late report the distinct sensation of tiny, cold hands brushing against their ankles, followed by a faint, desperate whimpering that seems to emanate from the very roots of the ancient live oaks. To spend the night at Huma's house is to understand that the past here is not dormant. It is actively filtering into the present, the sheer scale of historical suffering woven into the estate's very fabric guarantees that the cold, sad entities bound to the bayou will continue their spectral vigil, forever inhabiting the lavish rooms and silent, sprawling gardens they were never permitted to truly own in life. Thirty, Calcasieu Courthouse, Lake Charles. The air around the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse in Lake Charles is thick and humid, heavy with the weight of centuries of judgment. Built of imposing gray stone, the structure stands sentinel over Ryan Street, its neoclassical facade concealing a labyrinth of echoing marble halls and forgotten cells. But the true foundation of the courthouse is laid not on solid earth, but on the spectral legend of those who met their end within its walls, specifically the notorious murderess, Tony Joe Henry, in the 1940s. Tony Joe was convicted of killing a traveling salesman, a crime sensational enough to grip the entire state. She was held for years, fighting her sentence, before finally being executed in 1942. One of the last women to die in Louisiana's electric chair. They say the shock of the voltage didn't just extinguish her life. It tethered her spirit to the cold, unforgiving building. Her restless energy remains, a pervasive, almost palpable sense of fury and despair that modern employees learn to live with or flee from. The specific hauntings are subtle but deeply unsettling. Lawyers working late report the distinct, sickening odor of ozone and burning hair near the former jail annex, a stench that dissipates the moment they try to locate the source. More alarming are the elevator malfunctions in the oldest wing. Doors will open onto empty, dimly lit floors, despite the buttons never having been pressed. Sometimes they report hearing a woman's strained, low humming from the shaft, an unnerving, discordant melody that instantly drops the temperature of the car. But the most chilling manifestation occurs in the courtrooms where Tony Joe was tried. Witnesses describe fleeting glimpses of a woman with severely bobbed hair and stark eyes standing momentarily in the jury box, dressed in an outdated prison jumpsuit. When maintenance crews attempted to renovate one of the original holding cells beneath the courthouse, they found a deep scratch etched into the concrete wall, the initials T.J. He preserved perfectly, waiting for the next person to enter the domain of the damned. Magnolia Plantation, Natchitoches. The air over Natchitoches, Louisiana, is thick and wet, holding the echoes of every century that has stained the bayou country. Magnolia Plantation sits under a canopy of aged oaks, its white columns appearing less stately than spectral, bleached by relentless sun and sorrow. To step onto the grounds is to cross a threshold not just into the past, but into a sustained moment of suffering. The silence here is unnerving. It is the absence of natural sound, replaced only by the heavy, distant hum of unsettled energy that permeates the soil and the decaying cypress timber. Built originally in the 1830s, the plantation was a site of immense cotton production and profound human cruelty. The structure that stands today is not the first. The main house suffered a devastating fire around 1850, an event historians speculate was not accidental, sparked by desperation or sabotage, while the structures were meticulously rebuilt, including the iconic, elaborate spiral staircase. The land itself seems unwilling to let the ashes settle. Local legends center around a specific overseer, known only as Mr. Thorne, whose abrupt disappearance during the Reconstruction era was never solved. It is his lingering, possessive presence, compounded by the agony of those he subjugated, that guards the property with vicious intensity. The hauntings at Magnolia are not benign remnants. They are visceral and often aggressive. In the reconstructed slave quarters, investigators consistently report sudden, debilitating temperature drops, followed by the sound of heavy chains dragging across the dirt floors where none exist. Inside the main house, the spiral staircase is a locus of activity. Witnesses describe seeing a dark, fleeting shape too large and hurried to be human ascending the steps with alarming speed, only to vanish at the landing. Objects, particularly small, heavy ceramic pieces, are frequently thrown from the upper landing onto the foyer floor below. A deliberate, furious act that suggests active dismissal of the living. The most disturbing evidence, however, manifests in the oppressive feeling of surveillance. Photographic records taken in the late 1990s and early 2000s occasionally show faint, heat-distorted figures hovering near the former gin house, appearing translucent and violently contorted. Those who spend the night report awakening not to whispers, but to deep, guttural breaths directly at the ear, immediately followed by an urgent, inarticulate impulse to flee. Magnolia Plantation doesn't merely contain ghosts. It is a repository of persistent malice, forever rejecting peace and actively seeking to expel any intruder who reminds it of the light. Patti, the old Absinthe House, New Orleans. The air inside the old Absinthe House hung thick and sweet, smelling of spilled licorice and forgotten time. Dust motes danced in the solitary shaft of sunlight slicing through the grimy front windows, illuminating the chipped marble bar where generations had sought oblivion in the milky green liquid. This Royal Street establishment, dating back to 1806, was less a building and more a vessel for the Crescent City's accumulated sorrows. A place where the veil between the living and the dead had worn tissue thin. Its most persistent resident was not a drinker, but a worker, a spectral bartender known only as Mr. Perry. Legend holds that Perry was a meticulous employee from the early 1900s, perhaps too loyal, who died suddenly behind the very counter he spent his life polishing. He is not a malevolent spirit, but rather an attentive, if icy, one. Staff have long complained of the rigorous cleaning patterns, particularly the rhythmic, inexplicable wiping sounds emanating from the locked and empty bar late at night. Tools and bottles, placed carelessly before closing, are routinely found rearranged into precise, perfect rows by morning. The hauntings intensify when the house is quiet. Visitors and employees alike report a distinct, sudden drop in temperature around the service bar, often accompanied by the feeling of an unseen presence watching over their shoulder, silent and judgmental. On one occasion, a late shift manager stacking glassware witnessed a tumbler lifted slightly off the rail, hovering for a terrifying second before being gently, deliberately placed back down. It was a silent correction, an insistence on absolute order in a chaotic world. Mr. Perry's presence is a permanent fixture, an icy perfectionist eternally bound to the space. The ghost's ultimate power lies not in violence, but in unnerving intimacy, a chilling reminder that even after death, some people simply refuse to clock out. The next time the brass rail feels unnaturally cold beneath your hand, consider whose exacting standards you might be failing to meet. That closes the casket on our journey through Louisiana's 15 most chillingly haunted spots. Don't let the spirits be the only ones to subscribe. Hit that button and the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next shadow.